Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another episode of NucleCast. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Lowther. Now, this is actually part 2 of our discussion with Jonathan Trexel. If you'll remember from part 1, Dr. Trexel he's a retired intelligence officer. He worked in the DoD and STRATCOM for a long time, and now he is on the faculty at Missouri State, where he teaches in the graduate program that trains our deterrence folks. And it's Missouri State's program is one of the best in the country, of course. And so one of the things that Jonathan gets to do is to think about nuclear topics from the intellectual perspective, not just having to implement them now. And on the last episode, we never got around to talking about the NPR. And so we said, you know what, let's have another episode and let's talk the nuclear posture review. And so with that, I want to welcome Jonathan back into the show.
Thank you.
It's good to be here. So we were going to talk about the NPR, and we got cut off because we ran out of time. But today we're going to have that discussion. So as you look at the NPR, what were your broader takeaways?
Well, I actually was a bit surprised in a couple of ways. One, I was expecting almost the worst early on, where there had been some promises to reduce the roles and missions of nuclear weapons, and that was ill-defined. What was that going to look like in terms of policy going forward? And then at the other side, I was actually surprised because with the mounting threats facing us, both with Russia and what we're seeing with nuclear coercion, and with China with a rapid growth of its arsenal, and also threats and nuclear coercion, that I really thought the NPR would take a step forward into that emerging environment. And so I was kind of surprised that I didn't see things as bad as it would have been, but I was really surprised, given what's been happening just in the last year, that the NPR, which looks out into that future and it provides guidance on everything from policy and structure and what we need with nuclear forces out in the future for force adequacy. I thought they really needed to go lean into that because of the emerging threats and the time that it takes to respond to those, just with capabilities development, et cetera. I just thought it chose this sort of a middle ground that was safe. It checked some boxes, but it really didn't go where it needed to go. I'm happy that it didn't go sort of backwards and retro. But this was a golden opportunity to lean into this for our security and for our allies, and I think they missed the mark.
Yeah, I think it was one of those documents that disappointed everybody. Because for the advocates of nuclear disarmament, they didn't get a no first use policy. They didn't get a sole purpose policy. They're still in Sentinel got funded, Sentinel B-21 and all the sea-based modernizations to Columbia class and the D5. Right. So they didn't get to, but they canceled Slickum. So that was sort of the bone that was thrown to the disarmament crowd. And then, on the side of, for those who advocate for a robust nuclear deterrent, the idea that, I don't know what your thought was, but I'm less concerned about strategic nuclear exchanges. I'm really concerned about the United States failing to deter Russia or China or potentially North Korea or Iran from using lower yield tactical nuclear weapons. And slick them in was our best option. I want new Pershings, I want new Glickums, but slick them in was at least a step in the right direction.
Right. And I share that view. They retained the low yield Trident, but as you say, they just pushed back against this idea of the of the slick 'em in. And there was a reason why they wanted both. The Trident, the low yield Trident, was sort of that stopgap to get you to slick them in, and so it wasn't the end to answer that kind of regional or theater nuclear problem that you're talking about. It was merely a stopgap to get you to slick them in, which was going to take more time. And so in some ways, it just doesn't make sense for them to say that this low yield Trident satisfies all those deterrent requirements. It really does not do that. It has a very limited capability. It has some disadvantages because it's on a strategic platform when you're thinking about credibly using that. And when it comes to, just as you say, when it comes to this idea of trying to manage escalation from conventional all the way to non-strategic forces and strategic, we absolutely essentially have to modernize the strategic forces, but we're doing that. But all of the rest of those things are needed. If we're going to manage escalation and be able to communicate that we can do that, we have to have the means to do that at different levels of violence, with different capabilities, at different ranges, in different places, and have lots of flexibility and different options. This was sort of the whole idea of Kahn's theory of advantage, right? Unlike a balance of terror, the advantage idea was it recognized that there are a lot of uncertainties, and with uncertainties, you have to have a lot of options at your disposal because you don't know how those uncertainties are going to manifest themselves in the future. So Kahn was about a wide variety of capabilities, flexibility, options, but always retaining an advantage. And this is sort of the biggest area in the NPR where I was disappointed, where we look out at that future with a greatly and rapidly expanding Chinese threat, Russian threats with non-strategic forces, as you say. This is where this idea of sort of a smaller number or just relying on your strategic forces is really not appropriate for that kind of threat environment. And then we can argue about the kinds of things that might be needed, but what was presented in the NPR is not the one. It needs to be more robust in some way to get at that. Again, Kahn was one who favored advantage because of the uncertainties. I'm sort of in that camp. I would rather have advantage in forces and capability and options and flexibility. And with all those things, then we can deter across the board, and hopefully you don't get to any of those things. But as you had mentioned before, weakness is something that breeds the kind of ill behavior that we're trying to deter. And without those kinds of capabilities, to me, we're sort of in that weakness camp, and that's a place we don't want to be. We're incurring unnecessary risk.
Yeah, and it's interesting that for those who wanted to see no first use and sole purpose and want to, eliminate legs of the triad, I think I would have to say that they fundamentally misunderstand human nature. And they also fundamentally seem to misunderstand history, like the INF and how Reagan was able to ultimately negotiate INF was he did the exact opposite of what, advocates of disarmament want. He ultimately built a capability that put Moscow and St. Petersburg under threat. And then by virtue of them feeling the pressure and the threat from Glickam and Pershing, they therefore gave up more. Because if you look at their capabilities that they gave up, they were a much greater diversity and numerical advantage for the Russians than for what we ultimately built to then negotiate away. And so I wonder, as we think about Russia and China now, and they have these, short, medium, intermediate range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, all these other things that they're building that are below the strategic, and we have nothing by which to hold them at risk in that area. Are we not just encouraging them to move into the area where we've built a vacuum?
Well, I agree with that, and that's where we do have some limited capability with the low yield Trident, with some DCA in Europe, but the Slickum was essentially the minimum that we needed to walk into that area, and we're already seeing both Russia and China be very provocative, very assertive, not just in conventional or cyber or space, but with nuclear coercion. And there's a reason that they feel comfortable doing that. And we should feel a great sense, you talked about human nature, but, this idea that if we want to pursue arms control, or if we want to have some kind of restraint in nuclear forces, that has to be based on some measure of trust, or at the very least, a strong regime of verification. And we really don't have today the environment to do that, and we really don't see that on the horizon. And this comes back to ideas of con, where you have those kinds of uncertainties, those ideas of mistrust. In that kind of an environment, we really don't have a choice but to prepare to defend ourselves against those kinds of distrustful adversaries. They're not simply a competitor. They're not just simply states who are interested in growing their reputation. These are states who actually want to conquer and take territory. These are states that are threatening our allies. These are states with producing capabilities and greater capabilities to threaten the U.S. homeland, U.S. forces abroad. So to me, we have to take that very seriously on face value for what we're seeing. And now we find ourselves in this position where we are responding, we're reacting, and we're behind the power curve when it comes to having those kinds of capabilities to respond across the board. That takes a long time to do. An NPR is a chief policy instrument to help put us on that footing for the future. And that's why the NPR was so important with that kind of threat that's coming, that's there and coming, but it missed that mark. And I think that was a dangerous policy document to put forward, not just for us, because we, as we said, we're going to modernize our strategic forces, but what else are we doing? And it doesn't fall into any of those categories of what else to do. And our allies and our adversaries are looking at that. And I think it's a very strong message to our allies as well, that the U.S. did not go where they were expecting it to go, where it really needed to go. And I'm not sure how our allies are going to react to that.
Well, one of the other questions, that the NPR talks about is that they want to get back on back into the business of arms control. And I guess one of the questions I have is, we had the Biden administration extended New START for an additional 5 years. Have we engaged in a single verification act since New START was extended? Have we verified?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't think that we've had anything meaningful when it comes to arms control or verification. I think there have been some communications on test launches, that sort of thing. That's kind of standard fare. But if you look back in time, as we developed a relationship with the USSR, some of that you could look at, and we learned in this relationship one with another. You cited the INF. And because of those kinds of things that we learned over decades, both sides felt, and the U.S. as well, felt more willing to go down the road of arms control. There was some measure of a relationship there. where we thought we could reduce risks, we could reduce threats. It reduced our own forces as well, but in doing so, we thought we were providing for greater security. But it was based on a lot of years of relationship and learning. When this administration put forward the New START, this was before the Russians invaded Ukraine, and perhaps they're dealing with a bit of regret from that, where that kind of thing could have been used as leverage with what the Russians were doing in Ukraine. I'm not sure. But again, those kinds of things from the past were based on relationships and behavior. And now we're seeing we don't have any sort of an arms control relationship with China. And the relationship with Russia is eroding and has eroded. And this idea of mistrust is very, very strong. It's palpable. So I don't see arms control coming to the fore anytime in the near future. And that should connect with this idea of what that future threat environment is looking like and why the NPR and future NPRs need to lean into that threat environment. There won't be an opportunity for meaningful arms control for a variety of reasons. And the threat is coming at us in so many ways. And we have a lot of responsibilities for the U.S. and for our allies in multiple regions. And for that reason, we have to be much more assertive with what we're trying to do with our nuclear forces.
Now, the Nuclear Posture Review offered up this new concept, integrated deterrence. Now, I've written in Real Clear Defense about what I would call, sort of this false sense of integrated deterrence as a deterrent strategy, when in reality, integrated deterrence is actually the administration's grand strategy. If you look at what integrated deterrence is, it meets the definition of a grand strategy. And that grand strategy relies on, and growingly relies on, non-military means to advance national security interests, and seeks to expand whole of government, economic, which I'm okay with using those things. If you look at Chinese strategy, and Rob Spalding, retired General Rob Spalding, has a new book out that looks at the Chinese, came out in 1999, Unrestricted Warfare, that sort of laid out a Chinese strategy. And that strategy is largely reliant on misinformation, economic warfare, cyber warfare, all of these sort of non-traditional military means. So I like using those things because the Chinese are using them. But my concern is that this perception that we can deter by becoming less reliant on nuclear weapons. And I'm not sure that I've seen any indication that that's possible, or that any of our adversaries are buying it. Do you have a take on integrated deterrence? What was your thoughts as you looked at it?
Well, in terms of a grand strategy, if there was a lot of thought, serious thought into that in terms of a decades-long strategy, then it's very problematic. For example, as you mentioned with economic warfare, those sorts of things, part of what we're learning from the experience with Ukraine is that it has a lot of limits, and there are ways and workarounds for that. I think China is well ahead of that and learning from that, and they're already looking at different ways to alter that future environment in their favor, should those kinds of that kind of wide-scale sanctioning be placed upon them. So it has very limited capability. So do conventional forces. World War I and World War II taught us that about the limits of conventional forces to deter. To your broader point of the kinds of forces that we need to deter, it will come back to this idea that they have to be across the board. We need all of those things. My biggest concern when it comes to integrated deterrence is how our allies interpret that. And when we continue to say we want to reduce the roles and missions and the salience of nuclear weapons, and we have this ill-defined concept of integrated deterrence where there is no There is no integrator. There's no one assigned to do this. There's no dedicated funding to do this. So if it's a grand strategy, to me, it misses some of those just real basic ideas to it for infrastructure. If you're going to do that, to me, it seems a little bit more conceptual. But our allies, when they hear that, what I think they're hearing is the U.S. is not going to rely as much on nuclear forces to deter adversaries' attack on an ally. That, I think, is something that erodes Allied assurance. It erodes the whole concept of extended deterrence, because our adversaries are looking at, well, we could attack U.S. allies, and the kinds of threats that would be coming at me are, it's less about nuclear threats, it's less about even missile defenses, but it could be things like economic or conventional. Those are things that I think our adversaries are already taken into account in sort of their calculus of costs and fears of punishment. Nuclear forces are the things that will really get at putting fear into an adversary's calculus. And when those are being diminished in an environment where our adversaries are putting increased salience on nuclear forces, that should be alarming to us. And I believe that it's very alarming to our allies. And that's something that is, so this whole integrated deterrence concept, to me, our allies are hearing less role of nuclear forces to deter, and they feel more threatening and more risk because of that. So I think that's a mistake.
Well, it's time to take a quick break on NucleCast. We're talking to Jonathan Trexel, and we'll be right back. This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the 15th Annual Nuclear Deterrence Summit. Come join NucleCast at the summit on February 13th through 15th, 2023 at the Hyatt Regency Crystal City, Arlington, Virginia. Industry and government experts will be discussing management of the nuclear security complex, stewardship of the nuclear stockpile, arms control negotiations, and strategic policy. Stop by the NucleCast booth to say hello. Executive producer Kimberly Charrington and I will be there interviewing guests for upcoming episodes. You can find a registration link to the Nuclear Deterrence Summit with a 15% discount on the NucleCast website at anwadeter.org/NucleCast. We're back here on NucleCast talking to Jonathan Trexel. We've been talking about the Nuclear Posture Review, and you've been talking about this lessening of reliance on nuclear weapons. And I wonder, do you think that the recent change in defense policy by the Japanese is any reflection on their perception? Is it purely a concern about the Chinese, or do you think it could also be a reflection that they're concerned that the United States might not have the same military capabilities, nuclear, potentially conventional as well, to defend them, because they're spending more, they're really growing their defense capabilities and posture. So how do you see that? Is there any relationship between the NPR and this outcome?
Well, I think it's both. I think from Japan, over the last couple of decades, they have been growing a very capable layered missile defense system, one of the best in the world. A large measure of the threat coming to them is from ballistic missiles. But if you look at their annual reports, their security reports that they put out, their white papers, the narrative has increasingly changed from a threat from North Korea to a threat from China. And I think this growing and emerging threat from China, and again, China has been very vocal with coercion against Japan, but Japan has a deep stake in the defense of Taiwan. It has a deep stake in this region. So when it sees the threats on the one hand, and it sees there's no SLICM-N, there's no DCA, we have very limited capabilities. We have the problem, the tyranny of time and distance to get forces into theater. with a large potential Chinese aggression in the region. All of those things combined, I think, send alarm bells to people in Japan, and they're leaning into this. It's now going beyond discussions of simply defensive capabilities into the ability to use their own ballistic missiles for attack purposes to deter. Look, they've been in space. They know about ballistic missile technology. They're very good with that. So they're expanding their capabilities in space for intelligence, for early warning. All of these things should be signals to us that they think they need to do more on their end to have the deterrent effects that they're after, or to defend themselves. Their Navy is growing, all of these things. So I think it's a combination of Japan looking at the threat and what that environment looks like, and what the response of the United States has been, or more rightly, has not been.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I just finished a book that I would recommend to anybody. And I think that if I remember the title correctly, it's The End of the World is Just the Beginning. I can't remember the author's name, but it was sort of a broad look at trends. And one of the trends dealt with, the East Asia trends. And it was sort of positive in the sense that if you look at many of the trends for, everything from growing your own food to energy resources to, pop to demographics, China in the decades ahead is not going to be in a good position. They don't have their own energy. They can't grow their own food. And their population is, because of the one-child policy, they're going to have this cliff that they fall off of. Whereas the United States is potentially in the best position. We have our own energy. We can grow our own food. We have a stable population. And so therefore, we're in a pretty good position. And Japan, one of the points that they made was for conflict that the author made was that Japan has, probably the second best blue water Navy in the world. And so if the United States and Japan team up, this is quite significant for the Chinese, because the Chinese can't effectively project power. They can defend their territorial seas with, their Coast Guard and their maritime fleets, but they can't project water, sea power across the Pacific. And so I wonder if we can, it comes to a shooting match, if we can defeat the Chinese absent the use of nuclear weapons, absent, direct attack on the Chinese homeland, but through a sort of a strangulation where the United States becomes the boa constrictor to mainland China. And do we have the nuclear weapons that it would take to maintain that deterrence as we try to essentially choke China out and eliminate the Chinese Communist Party? Because that's really what we're after. We have no beef with the Chinese people, but the question is the Chinese Communist Party. And because we're at the end of the show, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, those are big and grand ideas. I haven't read the book. When it comes to Japan and certainly our other allies in the Pacific, I think they do take a very strategic view. And that's the view that the United States needs to take when it comes to dedicating a certain percentage of our GDP for defense. That needs to rise to a certain level. But if we are acknowledging this global threat for the next period of time, some measure of decades, from China, we have to step into that and address that in a very serious way, but in a strategic way. Strategic forces, nuclear forces, good combat conventional forces have to be part of that equation, and a good stable deterrence policy needs to be a fundamental part of that. And I just think we're still missing that. We're still falling short of that.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Jonathan Trexel. Thanks for coming on to the show again. We're glad we got to.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Glad we got to talk NPR, and I want to thank the listeners. And we'll see you on the next episode of NucleCast.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krumthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NucleCast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.